There are some things that a person who does not and has not opened themselves up to the potential of a world way beyond the material, you're never going to taste, you're never going to touch, you're never going to see. You will always be blind to it, you'll always be sense deprived of it.
Hello and welcome to Sacred Book, in which two old fellas talk long time about things to do with scripture and beyond.
Steve.
And Mark. This is a standalone, so there are no shorter with this one. Steve, if an atlas is a map of the world, perhaps we could say that the Bible, in part, is a map of the soul. We have talked about how to read scripture, pardes, the four ways. Somebody reading it for the first time may be surprised that there's poetry, as well as prose, and there's history, and myth and allegory. We have been covering Genesis 1 to 11, which you rightly said is mytho-history. What is mytho-history?
Yeah, what is it? It's a term that I quite like, because what it says to me is this is not make-believe. It's a genre in which real events are being relayed to us, but they're being relayed to us in a way which is figurative. In the 60s, Thurkild Jacobsen, a Syriologist, took examples of Mesopotamian texts regarding global floods, which would have no doubt come from the overflowing of the Tigris and the Euphrates. So they're real events, but then they're recounted to us in a slightly different way. Flood stories in this era were mythical retellings of these real events that were going on. When I look at the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and I do make a big distinction here with the first 11 chapters, because once you get into chapter 12 onwards, you're tied to a historical person called Abraham, who you can nail down in our timeline in a far clearer chronological form. But pre that, you're looking at a whole series of events. The way that they're being told is quite different. That does not mean that we should not take them seriously in what they're saying, but that we should not necessarily take them literally. That is the challenge for lots of people to get their head round and come to terms with, and a way which we can then unpack and get great meaning out of if we take the time to wrestle with what's being told us.
1887, a book called The Etruscans, an Historical and Critical Notice by Louis Piale, says this: sifting the historical truth from the chaos of myth is paving the way for the time when mythology will no longer continue to be called so, but will receive in the scientific world the new epithet of mytho-history. In other words, history mingled with fiction. Thus, the mythological narration, although not all truth, has in it a great deal of truth, and those tales therein detailed, sent down to historical times by the word of mouth, songs, family records and tradition, contain many truths.
Absolutely. The genre of scripture is so rich, so diverse, that we should read it sensitively, and we should read it in as much alignment with the original intent of the authors as we can possibly get our heads into to try and understand that. Which is why when we've talked about Genesis and opening accounts, that I am just not sure in reading this that the intent of the writer was to give us a materialistic account of the events of the world, but is to show us a functional account of what has been referred to as temple cosmology. The writer is actually depicting the creation of temple on earth, in which the image of God, man, sits. the richness of that and the truth of that is staggering.
It's like we said with, well, I said, with the possible scientific explanations for the flood, which I don't necessarily think are correct, but it's a way of saying don't just poo-poo it because it's in the Bible. There are comments on some of our previous videos that this is all nonsense. Someone even went as far as to say it's all lies. Very emotive language, saying there's no scientific evidence. Well, there is. Whether you join them up with scripture, that's down to you, but there is scientific evidence, don't deny that. William Lane Craig, he's talked a lot about it, Quest of the Historical Adam, and there's a lot of videos on YouTube about this.
He's had a lot of pushback. But you got to think about this. This is a dude who is a Southern Baptist. And he's presenting a worldview that the young earth creationists would not like, that perhaps the intelligent design theorists would not like, which would probably sit in his camp as Southern Baptists. Yet he's sticking himself out there and saying, actually, there's a lot that needs to be said here. I've got a little quote from him. He was asked a question about this. He says, "The point is that a figurative reading of the primeval narratives is not only permitted by the mytho-historical genre in general, but is also suggested by various clues in the narratives themselves that make such a reading plausible." I think he's on the money. The first 11 chapters of Genesis is far bigger, far more important, far broader than just trying to tie it down to a material, scientific basis, which I don't think it is meant to speak into. I don't believe that is the intent. And I'm not saying that there aren't aspects of it that could speak into those areas, but I'm not sure that that's what this is all about. This is about lifting the narrative to a much higher level and enabling so many of these wonderful things to infuse the story so that we can wrestle with it, so that we can unpack it, so that we can work through the symbology of it, and so that we can draw meaning out of it. You've only got to look at the work recently of Jordan Peterson, looking at Genesis, and you look at the psychoanalytical information that he pulls out as a clinical psychologist, just at that level of his clinical work and where he can see the truths of his clinical profession mirrored in the text. This transcends time and space. This is something far richer.
To really understand the Quest of the Historical Adam or the mytho-history part of it, either whether you're Christian or not, you've got to have an open mind. But I like to say that the mind is like a parachute, don't I? It only works when it's open. We'll pull the ripcord. The Oresteia, one of the earliest Greek tragedies. The stuff in there that's mytho-history and fable, I don't see people complaining about that. Yet for some reason you have it with scripture and it triggers quite a lot of people, either religious or not. Don't understand why that is. It must be something from their childhood that triggers people to say, oh no, that's not possible, but then they'll give a free pass to other material.
The Old and the New Testament, if you study it carefully, it brings you to a point where you have to make a choice. This is where I found myself years and years ago. I had to make a choice. Go with this or I reject it. And there was sufficient evidence for me to go with it. It changes life. And most people do not want their life changed. The Greek classics are not that likely to change your life because they don't put that demand on you. But the scripture, when you pull it apart, it's going to start to make some flipping big demands on you. And that's where people go, I don't like that. Nobody's making demands on me. I'm the boss of my life and I'll run it the way I want. There's something far bigger than you and far more important than you out there. And if you step into that relationship with that being who is far bigger and far more important than you, you'll find that your life has never been about you and it's actually about others.
There is a difference between myth and allegory and even fable. Fable is probably the easiest one. It comes from the Latin fabula. It's a story, fiction, whatever, often anthropomorphized animals. You get this with The Fox and the Hare. Aesop's fables. Then there's allegory, a story with a hidden meaning. It could be a moral meaning, a philosophical. Think of Plato's The Cave. People are chained, facing a wall, they see shadows, they think it's reality. It's like people looking at TV or online games and thinking it's real, but it's not. And you've got to break your mind away from thinking what you're being shown is real into the light of reason. That's allegory. But then there's myth. Stories with truth. It could be a metaphysical truth. Most people don't get metaphysics. It's beyond the physical. Cosmos. What is the origin? How come we're here? Social truth. Psychological truth. The psychology of Noah and what they went through is an immense story to try and grapple with and understand. And even if you think there was no Noah, there was no ark, no flood, think about the psychology involved, then that is real. Finally, think of perhaps the cornerstone of all Western culture apart from the Bible, Homer's Iliad. It contains a core of history. There was Ilias or Troy, that definitely existed. There were certainly, I think King Priam was real, perhaps even Achilles. But then you'll get the added bits that become mythical, which is the gods interceding on both sides and so on. But there is still truth in that. I think William Lane Craig says he wants us to see chapters 1 to 11 like we see the Trojan War. We hyperbolize the text, but that does not deny the fact that there is truth. You've got to consider then, what is the truth?
How we measure truth is really important, because we seem to get stuck into this mindset of, unless I can prove it scientifically, it's not true. Well, that's absolute, complete and utter nonsense. There's so many things that are true that you cannot measure scientifically. I'll draw on something that William Lane Craig said in an interview that I heard with him with Peter Atkins. He mentions, in amongst a good number of things that cannot be scientifically proven, i.e. as truth, but are perfectly rational to accept. So he goes to these 5 areas. Logical and mathematical truths can't be proven by science. Science presupposes logic and maths. To try and prove them by science is actually circular arguing. Metaphysical truths, like there are other minds other than my own, or that the external world is real, or that the past wasn't created 5 minutes ago with some sort of appearance of age. They're perfectly rational beliefs to hold, but they can't be scientifically proven. Ethical beliefs about statements of value are not accessible by the scientific method. You can't show by science whether the Nazi scientists in the Nazi camps did anything evil, as opposed to the scientists in Western democracies. Not by science, but we know that they did evil. Aesthetic judgments can't be accessed by the scientific method, because the beautiful, like the good, can't be scientifically proven. Science itself cannot be justified by the scientific method. Science is permeated with unprovable assumptions, such as the special theory of relativity. The whole theory hinges on the assumption that the speed of light is constant in a one-way direction between any 2 points. That simply cannot be proven. We have to assume that in order to hold the theory. And so none of those beliefs can be scientifically proven, but are accepted by all as true. And so when we look at myth, when we look at reading the scripture, we shouldn't be applying a empirical science test to it, we should be looking at, so does this make sense? Is this rational? Is this reasonable? Is this logical? Does this make sense to me? What this story is saying, does it make sense in what I see in life? And yes, it does, in so many areas. We shouldn't be frightened of all of the different genres in Scripture. We should be recognizing what those genres are, and then looking to draw what principles that story is telling us, and then looking to see how we can then bridge that principle forward to the 21st century where we live and enable our lives to live according to it. Which is a great way of doing things. And it takes a lot of the aggravation out of these silly arguments that we get sidetracked and distracted on.
Ad infinitum. I've become fascinated thinking about why some people see things in Scripture and other people don't. You may not perceive God in Scripture, and especially in something such as mytho-history. It will confuse people. My wife is a teacher of English, and she will say, some people don't get metaphor or simile. They just don't get it. The brain does not recognize or interpret. Myth is not history. History is not myth. But history can be mythologized.
Of course it can. 1 Corinthians 2:14 says the natural person does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they're folly to him, and he's not able to understand them because they are spiritually discerned. The spiritual person judges all things, but is himself to be judged by no one. For who has understood the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him, but we have the mind of Christ. Paul's talking there and he's saying that there are some things that a person who does not and has not opened himself up to the potential of a world way beyond the material, you're never going to taste, you're never going to touch, you're never going to see. You will always be blind to it, you'll always be sense deprived of it. You have to say, you know what, there's something far bigger than me out of here. There's something far bigger than all of this. Professor Hoffman, talking about the mind and how he, being a materialistic scientist, has now had to change his view, how he sees life because of his studies and where science has taken him. And he's now opened his mind to the understanding that we are far more than just our material makeup. That resonates with me as to the way that I see what the ancients called spirituality, the realm outside of our material realm that we cannot see, that science refers to as dimensions. The only way that we can understand it is in a book like something like the Bible that allows us to grasp some of those concepts. But we only do so very dimly. And one day we will view those through lenses that allow us to see properly. At the moment we are blinded to so much of that, and some people are so blind to it they cannot see any of it. You know, some of us have got reduced vision in it, but we can get a glimpse. But other people are just completely blind to it.
Through a glass darkly. The thing about mytho-history is, why do we have it? Why does it exist? I wonder if it's a way to root people. Imagine the Hebrews at the time of Moses, and they wanted to know, why are they there? What came before? The mytho-history of chapters 1 to 11 is a way of explaining things without a physical example. Some concepts are so hard to grasp that you need, or some people who may not necessarily have learned to read and write, but they can hear and they listen, they need examples of stories that will ground the story into their reality. I read a book once about the Tudor period. This is British history now. And the problem with a lot of modern books that write about the Tudor period, they take out the one component that was the most important to everybody who ever lived at that time. And that is God. It's almost become a godless story of events. But for the people who lived back then, God was in the corner of every room. It was this presence that was always there. So for the ancient Hebrews, it would have been similar. God was always present somewhere around them. So then why do we have such a thing as floods? Well, here's a mytho-history of a flood in which a forebear of the people who are listening are told that you can do this, you can show your faith, there's hope. I wonder if that's the reason why mytho-history in all cultures and all faiths is present, because it's important.
It's an anchor point. Etiology, the cause, the origin of something. It anchors the realities that we see today in the world into something far greater than us. Us ex-Navy men, we've seen the ship as we drop anchor, and that anchor plummets down and it hooks onto the seabed, and it holds us there, and it doesn't matter what's tossing around on the top, we're held there. Finnish folklorist Lauri Honko wrote a book called The Problem of Defining Myth in Sacred Narrative. He says this: myth, a story of the gods, a religious account of the beginning of the world, the creation, fundamental events, the exemplary deeds of the gods as a result of which the world, nature and culture were created, together with all parts thereof, and given their order, which still obtains. A myth expresses and confirms society's religious values and norms. It provides patterns of behaviour to be imitated. It testifies to the efficacy of ritual with its practical ends and establishes the sanctity of cult. When you think about societies that are looking to bring that sort of pattern of behaviour, bring that ritual into life, anchored right back into the dawns of time, into myth, I think that's why we have it. It's not saying it's not true, it's saying it's far more true than we realise. For me, is the way that you read all of Scripture. You try and discern what genre it is. You try and look at the principles of the truth message which is being conveyed to us. You try and look at those principles and how they then bridge forward. And you say, well, what does that mean for us today in the 21st century? How do I apply those truth principles to my living today? Because they are worthy of us giving some credit to. They are certainly not worthy of just dismissive comment.
We have examples much more closer to date of events that you could say is mytho-history. The Angels of Mons, the battle in World War I, when the British soldiers reported that they saw angelic beings suddenly appear in the mist that helped them in that battle. At the time it was seen as propaganda, or it was just mass hallucination. It was a factual battle, 1,000 years into the future. How are people going to be reading that? They'll just say it's mytho-history.
Yep.
Well, that's not to say it didn't happen. And this is the key. They believed it happened. The thing about mytho-history is that we may be suspicious of it with our modern 21st century viewpoint. But the ancients believed it. And that's all that matters. Nothing else. Whether you think it's mytho-history, made up, they believed it. At the very first, that's the understanding you should approach this with.
It speaks to trying to understand the culture. It speaks to trying to place yourself as much as is feasibly possible and view this account through the eyes of the ancient people, rather than back reading your Greek thinking mindset into it, which thinks form and not function. Whereas a Hebraic perspective will often always be function, not form. What does a thing do rather than what's the thing look like? Very important that we read that like that and that we spend time doing that.
First 11 chapters you're coming across have kernel of truths. They may have something layered on, which if you read literally seems to convince people that how could this possibly happen? That's not the point. The metaphysical, symbolic understanding is important.
When you read it, you should be looking to say, what is this account looking to tell us about? It's telling us about order, meaning, morality, and destiny. It's laying it all out in a figurative way in which we can understand, which is incredibly true.
Today as much as it was then.
Timeless. And I would also say there is nothing to stop a God who is all-powerful in creating a world in exactly the way he wants, in exactly the amount of time that he wants. Could God have done it in 7 days? Yeah, of course he could if he'd wanted to. Could he have done it in that order? Yeah, of course he could if he'd wanted to. Is that what this account is actually telling us he did in a material sense? I don't believe that that's necessarily the best way to read it. I think the best way to read it is to look at what is God telling us across that broad setting, that the writers were not looking to convey a purely materialistic view of what was going on. They're looking to tell us bigger truths. And so for me, I would look at this as a mytho-historical account. Absolutely true, presented in a figurative way.
I agree, and I would add that Bereshit, Genesis, or Genesis, is the origins. It's not just the origins of the physical, it's the origins of the spiritual, and such concepts of endeavour, hope, gratitude, faith. That's what this is talking about. Can't physically show that, so you therefore have mytho-history that will give you examples that will root your community into say, that's an example of where it comes from, even though I cannot physically say there's the evidence to show it.
All right, fella, look after yourself.
Okay.
Cheers now. Bye.